The United Nations is facing one of the most demanding times in its history. The COVID-19 pandemic, extreme climate events, together with political unrest around the globe, has challenged the UN like never before. I sat down with Secretary General Antonio Guterres to find out how he's defending multilateralism and dealing with these crises. I'm Frank Ucciardo, and you're watching TRT World One-on-One. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, thank you for joining us here on TRT World.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
You are about to begin your second term as Secretary General come January. This is a particularly challenging time for the UN. What do you see ahead for this organization, and particularly with the pandemic? I remember you were critical of nations not coming together. Where do we stand on that now?
Unfortunately, I think the world is moving in the wrong direction. We face a pandemic that we are not able to control. In my country, that was quite successful. We have 80% of the people vaccinated. Countries in Africa have less than 2%. This is absolutely unacceptable from the moral point of view, but also because it allows the virus to spread like wildfire in the global south, mutating. And we know that one day there will be a mutation that might make vaccines irrelevant in the north and in the south, which means that to maintain this injustice, this complete separation of situations between the rich and the poor is also an impediment to defeat the virus for all of us. And then look at climate change. Today, we had a publication by the UN organization that supports the COP, the conference, and looking into the commitments made by member states until now, those commitments would lead to an increase of temperature in the end of the century of 2.7 degrees, which would be a catastrophic situation. And we know, the scientific community has told us, that to reach carbon neutrality in the middle of the century, we'd need to have a reduction of 45% of the emissions during the next 10 years, 2020 to 2030. This report shows that, according to the commitments made until now, the emissions, instead of going down 45%, would go up 16%, which means we are on the verge of a suicide. On the other hand, we see with Afghanistan, with the Sahel, with so many other situations, we see the security deteriorating. So there is, unfortunately, a huge division in today's world. Geopolitical division, geostrategic division, several areas of confrontation among big powers, but also among small and mid-sized powers, a bit everywhere. And this makes the work of the UN extremely difficult. So we need, in these circumstances, to make people understand that we are on the verge of a precipice, and when you are on the verge of the precipice, you must make sure that the next step in the right direction. And for that, we need to strengthen multilateral institutions. Look at the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization has not the authority to gather all the information it needs or to do an investigation of what happened in one situation. So we need multilateral institutions with teeth, with the capacity, with the authority to be able to improve the governance of these dramatic problems that we have, and in relation to which our present international institutions are too weak to make sure that we can defeat the enemies we face, the virus, the climate, and the generalization of conflict and insecurity.
Now, Ms. Secretary General, I know since the beginning of you taking office that climate change was at the top of your agenda, and you had mentioned a code red and it possibly being irreversible. Are we past midnight on this? Is it at the point of no return now?
The scientists are telling us that we are still on time. We are still on time to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees at the end of the century and to reach carbon neutrality in the middle of the century. But we are very close to tipping points that might make it irreversible for these objectives not to be attained. And what is worrying is that less than 2 months before the COP, we still do not have the commitments we need in relation to finance, the amounts that developed countries need to put at the disposal of developing countries, in relation to the support to adaptation and resilience. I mean, especially in fragile countries, the impacts of climate change are already being devastating. And we need to have 50% of climate finance to support this adaptation. And at the same time, we still have emissions growing instead of emissions reducing. And it will be important not only that developed countries reduce their emissions, but also that some emerging economies that today have a huge dimension in the world are also able to contribute to the reduction of emissions in order to make sure that we get to carbon neutrality in the middle of the century.
Mr. Secretary General, we were talking about the pandemic before. How will that make this year's General Assembly different? Will it be any different from last year? More diplomats are coming to town this year. How will that shape what goes on in the coming week?
Well, unfortunately, these will only have a limited number of heads of state and government present, and most of the events, except the main debate, most of the events will be virtual. And as you know, in diplomacy, the human contact is very important. So we badly need to defeat this virus to see if we can start working normally in the United Nations as around the world, and if we can restore the kind of diplomacy in which personal contact helps to build trust. Unfortunately, there is a moment of mistrust in the international community. And we need to build trust, we need to overcome divisions, and for that it will be very important for people to be able to be together, to be able to exchange views, instead of just speaking to a camera and obviously without the possibilities of dialogue that only physical presence can guarantee.
Mr. Secretary General, you quoted as basically saying that it is a fantasy that the UN can handle and solve Afghanistan's problem alone. Is that true?
Well, what I said is clear. I've seen some expectations, namely from countries that were involved in the Afghan situation with troops in Afghanistan, from people from those countries saying, now we left, but now the UN. It's for the UN to guarantee that the Taliban will have an inclusive government, that all the rights of women and girls will be respected, that terrorism will have no way to develop in Afghanistan. And what I say is, look, I mean, you have countries that have had hundreds of thousands of soldiers, that have spent trillions of different currencies, that were there for 2 decades, and they didn't manage to solve these problems. Do they think the UN, that has no money, no troops, only the power of its authority, moral authority, and the capacity to deliver humanitarian aid that is important for the Afghan people, and I believe should be respected and would be respected by whoever is in charge of the country? So I think that we will be able to do, and we will be able to engage the Taliban. The first high-level delegation that went to Kabul was by our Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. We are engaging the Taliban in order to make sure that we have humanitarian aid distributed in a way that is impartial, that reaches everybody, that there are no discriminations. At the same time, we have been insisting on the importance of rights of women, rights of girls. But, I mean, what we have is a power of persuasion and the possibility to lead the humanitarian relief to the country. But to think that the UN will be able now to solve all the problems that the entire world was not able to solve in 20 years, obviously is a fantasy.
Mr. Secretary General, I have to ask you directly, can you trust the Taliban to ensure the safety and human rights of UN agencies on the ground and the rights of women and children now?
I have to say that the dialogue that is taking place has been constructive, but of course, this is not a matter of trusting or not trusting. I mean, it's unpredictable. What I can tell you is that without engaging the Taliban, we will never be able to guarantee any of those aspects. So our duty is to engage. Our duty is to mobilize the international community for humanitarian support to Afghanistan, and at the same time to make the Taliban understand that without the respect of those rights, without those conditions, even the work to support their population becomes impossible.
Turkey's foreign minister has said it's a humanitarian gesture and it's really important, a moral duty to give aid to Afghanistan. How important has it been that Turkey has been able to help with aid to Syria, take in Syrian refugees, and now deal with Afghan refugees?
I was High Commissioner for Refugees. And for several years, Turkey was the most important partner of the High Commissioner. I mean, Turkey had the largest number of refugees of any other country in the world. And the refugees in Turkey lived with conditions that sometimes we wouldn't find in many other countries. I've seen camps that were very well organized. I've seen the possibility of the refugees to go to school, the possibility of many of them to start working. So Turkey has been a very generous host of refugees, and from that point of view, I think Turkey deserves the admiration and the solidarity of the entire world.
A lot of people are wondering, Mr. Secretary General, during this General Assembly, who's going to be sitting in the seats of Afghanistan and Myanmar? Does the UN recognize a country whose government has been taken over by coup?
This is a matter that is not for the Secretariat to define. It's for the member states to decide who to recognize as a legitimate government of a country. We have here a credentials committee. It's the credentials committee that accepts credentials. And obviously, only when a country is recognized or a government is recognized by the member states, that government can be represented in the bodies of the UN.
In closing, Mr. Secretary General, how does Antonio Guterres get up every morning with the weight of the world on his shoulders? Where do you find your resilience?
Well, I wake up every morning reconciled with the world, because usually I go to bed angry with the world. But when I wake up, I'm reconciled, because this is a very tough job. But it is also something that is, I would say, enthusiastic, and something that is fascinating. And whatever we can do to help people not to die in a conflict, whatever we can do to bring humanitarian aid to people in distress, whatever we can do to support women for equality in whatever country in the world, that's really worth.
Mr. Secretary General Antonio Guterres, thank you for joining us here on TOT World.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.